No, there is no yielding at this time. Okay, all right then, thank you. The next guest speaker is from Hillel. So, okay. You will have 30 minutes, and that includes time for questions.
Okay. I think all of us here deeply care about human rights, about peace, about social justice. Certainly I do. I come from I'm an associate professor of international relations who spent 15 years also interviewing people in the nascent Palestine and Israel, and I have a book coming out with Cambridge University Press in May about some of those peace processes that I look at. I've also, before I became an academic, I had a master's concentrating in human rights and international law, interned with the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, with Human Rights Watch, with the U.S. Committee for Refugees on Palestinian refugee issues, have been very involved with and actively involved with the peace movement my entire life, opposed strongly settlements in the West Bank, and opposed several of the policies that were mentioned here. However, I strongly oppose this resolution today, and I'll let you know why. The reason is because it's precisely because I'm not here to take a side that I oppose the imposition on you that forces you to take sides in a very complex conflict. So if you just heard the last speaker, what we have here is not two peoples who both deserve a right to self-determination, who both we should understand and empathize with and support in the current negotiations ongoing today. We don't have two peoples, the majority of whom have accepted a two-state solution over the past 20 years and are supporting the peace process. What we have here, actually, according to the BDS movement and according to the last speaker, is we have a monster, an evil devil, on one side, right? And we have a righteous, innocent victim and saint on the other. This is not a war where you have two parties who both have made mistakes, who both have contributed to the continuation of conflict, who both have contributed to suffering the other. No, this is a devil versus a saint, and you must take sides. And I beseech you to say no to this. Be pro-Palestine, pro-Israel, and pro-peace. It's not a zero-sum game. And one thing that I use in my classroom is someone who's devoted to peacemaking. Amos Oz, an Israeli novelist who's been active in the peace movement for decades, who has opposed the occupation in the West Bank for decades. And he says this is a conflict, a tragic, tragic conflict between right versus right. One people who deserves the right to self-determination, another people who equally deserves the right to self-determination. This is what makes it tragic. This is not a good guy versus bad guy. This is not a Hollywood movie where you can wave your little finger, as he says, and you determine in a very simplistic way who the bad guy is, who the good guy is, choose it, and punish the bad guy. This is not the situation we're in. And if we want to understand and empathize with the dreams and rights of both peoples, we can't demonize one of the peoples. And no one here should be trying to demonize either Palestinians or Israelis, the human beings on both sides. And what we just heard was a tirade creating a monster of one of the sides. Secondly, I like to say that although the resolution itself talks about a couple companies and what they're doing in the occupied West Bank and such. What you really heard is what the really BDS movement is really about, which is not what a particular company is doing. It's not about opposing the occupation of the West Bank. It's about opposing Israel. And we just heard that from the last speaker. You can look at the website of the BDS movement, see references to 1948, see references to discrimination within the 67 borders. The leader, Omar Barghouti, opposes two states, has said so publicly, says that if you have a full refugee turn, you'll have two Palestines next to each other. So the resolution says we're for self-determination for peoples, except for Jewish Israelis who are not for self-determination for, and BDS is not opposing. So what we heard now, does what happened in 1948 relate to what a specific company is doing in the West Bank now? No, the facts are also wrong in terms of 750,000 people being expelled. About 150,000 were, I think, shamefully, forcefully expelled. A lot of others left for a variety of other reasons and actually weren't forced to expel. That's a different story. If we are going to judge what companies do in different countries based on how the country was formed because it was attacked by several countries and in the midst of war of survival amongst refugees who would be killed if they lost the war. Okay? And practically every state in the world has been created through war and has its own stories, whether it's India and Pakistan of expulsions of people or whether it's our own country that shamefully committed genocide, I would argue, against the Native Americans. This resolution is not supposed to be about 1948, but this is what it's become. It's not about what's going on in the West Bank today. It's trying to look at Israel from 1948 on and criticize even what's happening in the 1967 borders. The resolution itself, interestingly enough, there's no endpoint for when the boycott would stop in here. There's no, once the Palestinian Authority and Israel agree to a peace agreement, then the boycott would stop. There's nothing in here about that. So we are left uncertain when you vote for this. When would the boycott stop? According to the last speaker, it maybe wouldn't stop until if Israel got out of the West Bank, it wouldn't stop. If you had two states, it wouldn't stop. Because then you're going to start talking about the right of return for Jewish Israelis. So when would it stop? When it didn't become a Jewish majority state? When it changed its flag, even though 50 other states have religious symbols on their flags in the world? More than a dozen countries have laws of return in which if you're Irish or a German or lots of other countries' nationalities, you have priority in gaining citizenship. The new Palestinian state will have a right of return for Palestinian refugees and favor Palestinian refugees in gaining citizenship. This is a matter of nation states and how they operate in today's world and how many countries choose to operate. You can agree with it, you disagree with it. It's not unique to Israel, and it's not about ethnic purity. Very quickly, if you look at the Bedouins, this is not about ethnic purity. It's a matter of traditional nomadic peoples versus the modern state. The same thing is happening in Jordan. The same thing is happening in Egypt. The same thing is happening in Saudi Arabia. And you can have a problem with Bedouin homes being destroyed and relocated to cities. I find parts of that problematic. That's happening in many countries in the Middle East, not because of ethnic purity, but because of modern states vying with nomadic peoples for how they should structure their land and so forth. So I think the last speaker shows you that this is not about the occupation of the West Bank. It's not clear when the resolution refers to occupied Palestinian territory, which territory does it refer to? Does it refer to everything since 1948? Israel itself and pre-67 borders is occupied and the boycott should continue until it's left intentionally unstated in the resolution. What companies should be boycotted? Again, not clear. All companies who are complicit. Well, if you look at part of the academic boycott that's part of this BDS, all academic universities should be boycotted, even though the vast majority of academics in them vote for parties who vote against occupation and for getting a peace settlement, even though 30% of the students at Haifa University are Palestinians, even though they're affirmative action for Palestinians, even though chairs of departments are Palestinian. It's not one university. It's not one university in the West Bank. If you look at it, all institutions are deemed complicit. So are all Israeli companies complicit? Doesn't say anything in this resolution about that, intentionally so. I think another thing to quickly note is the resolution denies a country the right to self-defense. Israel does face enemies. It has about 150,000 rockets pointed at it. Hezbollah on one border, who's aiding Assad now massacre 150,000 people in his country, is for the destruction of Israel and indiscriminately fires rockets at Israel. Now Syria is being armed by Russia to kill its citizens, as we know, with sophisticated military equipment. It's at a state of war with Israel. Now there are rebels affiliated with Al-Qaeda at Israel's border who have attacked peacekeeping forces on the border, who may attack Israel. In the Sinai Strip, you have Al-Qaeda-linked forces in Egypt that indiscriminately attack Israel through rockets. The same thing in Gaza with Hamas. So we might agree or disagree with certain policies, but I think there's no question that Israel faces threats and might need some military equipment and helicopters to face those threats, even regardless of the Palestinians, and we can talk about how they're used and when they're used in that particular circumstance. Fourthly, you're not only asked to take a side between a monster and a saint in a very complicated conflict that begs that question. By the way, there's very sophisticated public opinion polling within the West Bank and Gaza that shows that most Palestinians see Israel as a strong democracy. They have many criticisms of it, but they see it as a strong democracy they'd like to emulate in many ways. But you're not only asked to take sides between a devil and a saint, you're asked to take sides within argumentation within Palestinian politics as to what strategy should be taken. The elected president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, who's now in the midst of negotiating a peace treaty from Israel, since Israel is willing to withdraw from most of the West Bank and willing to create a Palestinian state. I don't think Netanyahu is going far enough. We can argue about that. But elected president, the elected leader by over 60% of the people in the last election says he's against boycotting Israel. And you, students in Michigan, mostly Americans in Michigan, are going to say, elected presidents of the Palestinian Authority, you're wrong. We know better than you what's good for your people. You're taking sides within the Palestinian community. And finally, the very last point that I'll quickly make is, ironically enough, this is supposed to be a resolution against discrimination, against prejudice, but it begs you to act in a very prejudicial and discriminatory way. Because as the speaker said, oh, Uganda has human rights problems. We're creating a fence. By the way, I oppose where the wall is created. 95% is a fence. There are dozens of countries around the world who have fences at their borders, etc. That's another story. But in the name of acting against discrimination, Israel alone is singled out. I happen to advise a student group on sweatshops. We look at companies that use sweatshops in all countries around the world and have objective criteria for doing this. There is absolutely no objective criteria for all the companies one should be looking at who are maybe engaged in occupations. What about China and Tibet? China won't even negotiate Tibetan autonomy versus independence, unlike Israel. If a Tibetan demands boycott, he's tortured and imprisoned. That's why we're not hearing from Tibetans. Why isn't there a call for boycotting China? What about Turkey and its occupation of northern Cyprus? What about Morocco and its occupation of Western Sahara? What about Russia and its occupation of Chechnya? None of these countries, unlike Israel, which is in the midst of negotiating independence and withdrawal from territory, none of this is happening in the other occupations. What about Syria, 150,000 people? Sudan, 300,000 people dead, etc. You must have some kind of objective criteria for determining which companies you will boycott. Why only Israel? The claim is the starting point? No, that's discriminatory. That's what the vast majority of presidents of universities in this country have determined, that one of their problems with the boycott movement is precisely because it is discriminatory. So in the name of opposing discrimination, you're asked to engage in discrimination by pinpointing one country alone, the one country in the world that's a Jewish majority country. So therefore, I strongly oppose you, and I hope that you'll seriously consider those points.